Redditors who worked at defunct stores, Blockbuster, Circuit City, etc. When did you realize they were done for? I worked at Babies R Us for 3 years. For part-timers, our hours would fluctuate based on sales from the previous weeks. If we had a bad week, as much as 75% of us would get called off future shifts. It was so random. I could have 10 hours one week and 34 hours the next. It felt like the employees were not the only ones living paycheck to paycheck. I worked in a store in college that did that. Most of our customers were living on retirement checks that came on the 1st and 15th. So we would be slammed a few days around check time and then slow until the next checks, so you'd have a slow week, so no hours the next week when the store was slammed. Busy store meant more hours the next week, which was dead. Corporate never figured it out. Former CompUSA employee. The speed at which they started changing the slogan increased. They introduced and rescinded a reward/loyalty program inside of 6 months, and they started pushing bait and switch selling tactics in our monthly store meetings. I handed in my resignation the day before they announced the company closing. Ex-CompUSA computer sales guy here. We were told the company had a new tactic, force a price war with Micro Center in an effort to drive them out of business. Literally selling stuff at cost or even below. This went on for several months. Macro Center sales staff worked on margin commission, and we were straight salary, and part of the idea was to frustrate the hell out of their sales guys, because they had to price match at cost, so they weren't making anything. At least that's what we were told. As far as I could tell, it made no dent in our rival's operation, but it definitely hurt CompUSA. Macro Center in our area is still around, and CompUSA isn't. Great for buyers, but a terrible idea otherwise. I left because they fired the only decent manager I had, plus they stopped letting me negotiate my earnings up, even though I was selling as much as the 3 guys behind me combined. A few years later, and the company was kaput. I worked at Blockbuster. I was there when they started Blockbuster Total Access to compete with Netflix. You add movies to your account, they mail the DVDs to you. You can return the DVDs to any Blockbuster as soon as they scan them, and you'll get the next movies on your list sent out, so you didn't have to wait as long for turnaround. Even better, you were able to rent a movie at the Blockbuster for free that you turned it in at. It was actually a great service. You could get tons of movies, and it was really easy to get people interested in signing up for it. Foot traffic in stores increases. The amount of candy and snacks we sold increased. We even had an uptick in paid movie rentals for non-new releases, cause parents would exchange their movie for a new release and get a couple for the kids as well. Then they started to change it. Restricted the amount of movies you can exchange each month. Different plans had different restrictions on what movies you could get, how many new releases, etc. It became really difficult to explain to customers because there were so many restrictions in place. After a bit you couldn't exchange a movie in store at all. Foot traffic died again, and the chain along with it. TBF, this was hemorrhaging money. This was a tactic to strike at the heart of Netflix. It almost worked, but Blockbuster was losing so much money that the board reined in or fired their CEO. If they could have kept it up, they could have possibly bankrupted Netflix. Instead, it was a half measure. Netflix had to respond, and it hurt them to the point of breaking, but they survived it. When Blockbuster backed off, Netflix was able to survive. And a surviving Netflix means Blockbuster's days were numbered. Worked at Best Buy for a while, got fired, and then went to work at Circuit City. I knew it the second I walked into that store. 6 months later we were told it was closing. Best Buy constantly updated fixtures and layouts/designs. Everything was bright and new. I imagine that Circuit City looked exactly like it did when it first opened. Can confirm. My dad has always been super loyal to good salespeople, and he met Steve shortly after I was born when he went to surprise my mom with a new TV. Told him about my birth. Steve slapped his employee discount on the transaction as a congratulations, and that was that. Steve was our appliance/electronics guy. He called my dad in '91 when the first Circuit City opened in my city to let him know he'd moved and suggested we come out to the grand opening. I remember it because they had free popcorn and hot dogs, and I got the running pad for my Nintendo. The store was exactly the same, minus the appliances, when Steve called us to let us know he'd stashed some 80% off home theater equipment for us when they closed down. Shortly after the Gamma Cube came out, I called all over town to try and find one. Nobody had one. I ended up calling Circuit City one day and the guy told me, yeah, we just got a shipment in this morning. We've got a whole bunch of them. We immediately hopped in the car, drove all the way across town to Circuit City, walked in, and looked for the Gamma Cubes. The whole Gamma Cube section was bare. So I asked an employee where they were, telling him that I had called in, and they told me they had them. He laughs at me and says, and you believed him? Nobody has them. We aren't getting another shipment for a month. I never went back to Circuit City. I worked for Borders from 2000 to 2008. When I was laid off I was working what had originally been 3 job descriptions. They decided to eliminate that position too, and dump all the work on my already overworked boss. Called it restructuring and other corporate weasel words, but I could see the ship was sinking. Still miss that place. Borders was by far the best retail job I had. I began working there while going to college in 2003. I started in the cafe, Borders Cafe, not SBC yet. Graduated December 2007 and spent the next 2 years looking for a job within my degree field because all of the jobs had dried up, but I stayed with Borders until something came along. The store was ran wonderfully by a great GM and the management staff. My coworkers were incredible and really cared for the place, but it was obvious corporate had no clue what they were doing. The CEO turnover was off the scale. Every time you turned around, there was a new CEO. The employees tried like hell to make it work, but it was all for naught. I finally took a job overseas in 2010 and moved back in 2011. The store closed shortly after I got home. It was and still is a bummer. It was the only bookstore in my area that I ever cared to visit. I worked in the warehouse at Sears in college until 2007 when I graduated. We were regularly running out of inventory and everything seemed like it had to be ordered in on a case-by-case basis. I was the person in the back that loaded the toolboxes, treadmills, snowblowers, etc. into vehicles. When you're running out constantly of your top revenue generating pieces, something isn't right. Also, they didn't even bother updating inventory. I had a friend there that walked off with a couple of big screens and nobody ever even noticed. I worked at a Sears hardware store in high school and on a few breaks when back from college. It was the same kind of experience you'll hear others tell about shuttered stores. Obviously not nearly enough customers. When they opened the Home Depot 2 miles down the road, I knew it was just a matter of time. Perhaps the weirdest thing was in the break room. They had a piece of paper on the wall with a bunch of tombstones bearing the names of rivals who had closed. I don't remember what stores were on the tombstones other than Lowe's being on one. Even at the time, this was the mid-90s, I thought that was a little premature and in somewhat bad taste. Yes, years ago, back in the 1990s, we always used to buy major appliances at Sears and get their repair contract, which was awesome. Something went wrong with your washing machine. They'd send out a real repairman who'd have the spare parts, or could get them in the next day or so. Their repair contract was so good you could, and would, buy it on non-Sears appliances as I recall. Then at a certain point, it turned into some incompetent ill-trained guy coming out, and they didn't really know what was wrong, but they'd tell you to order a part, and it would take 2 weeks to order the part, and you had to order it yourself, and you couldn't reschedule the return appointment until you had received the part, and that would take another 2 weeks. So you'd be without your fridge or washing machine for a month. I remember at that point I just hired a local appliance repairman. He came out, identified the problem, fixed it, and that was that. No more Sears for me. Interesting to watch Lowe's and even Best Buy cleverly zooming in to fill the gap, successfully. Sears owned the mail order business. All they had to do was switch it to online and all they had to do was keep up the quality of their products and their services. But they simply didn't. Terrible example of a terribly run business. I worked at Lonister Steakhouse. There's not too many of them left anymore, if any. I worked an open to close shift one night by myself, had 2 tables, and made $12. I started a career elsewhere shortly after that, and 6 days after I left Lonister for the new position the restaurant closed. The employees weren't told either. They showed up, and the place was shut down by corporate already. Edit. Did some follow-up research. Last one in the US. Closed in October 2019. Still one running apparently in Guam of all places. Guess I'll have to plan a visit. Get me a Texas Rose. Second edit. The Lone Star Grill franchise in Canada is not the same as Lonester Steakhouse in America. Just found that out.